Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take complex research and, well, we dive deep, giving you the essentials and exploring why it all matters. Today, we are tackling something really challenging, a kind of philosophical, ecological paradox of our times. We're looking into a significant synthesis paper from Frontiers in Ecology and Evolution. It's led by Benjamin L. Allen, and the title is quite something: Ethical Arguments that Support Intentional Animal Killing.
Yeah, that title definitely makes you pause. And this paper is so important because it's like a big audit of modern ethics. The authors aren't, trying to argue for animal killing across the board. It's much more subtle than that. They're showing how the very ethical frameworks people usually grab to condemn killing animals, think animal rights or utilitarianism, well, those same frameworks can actually be used to ethically support it, sometimes even mandate it.
Wow, okay. That immediately flips the script on the whole debate, doesn't it? It forces us to ask much tougher questions than just, is killing okay or not? Because let's be honest, intentional killing of animals happens all the time. It's everywhere in human activity.
Oh, absolutely. The paper mentions is huge, at least 10 major contexts. You've got wild harvesting for food, protecting human health and safety, agriculture, obviously, invasive species control, which is big in conservation, research, recreation like hunting. It's just woven into how humans interact with the planet. And that's not changing overnight.
Right. But at the same time, especially over the last, 50 years or so, particularly in more Eurocentric societies, there's this growing sense of moral unease, a real discomfort with humans deliberately ending animal lives.
Exactly. And when people argue against killing, they often appeal, quite rightly, to established moral systems, focusing on suffering, like Peter Singer did, or individual rights, like Tom Reagan. The problem, as the paper points out, is these debates often hit a wall, an impasse, they call it.
Like two sides just shouting from different planets using different ethical languages.
Precisely. So this paper tries to bridge that gap, or maybe show the bridge was already there. It demonstrates that there's internal consistency, even for lethal action, within those very philosophies.
Okay, let's really unpack this. What's the core novelty here? I mean, the methodology. They start by granting a key point often made by animal rights folks, right? That animals do have moral standing.
That's a critical first step. They say, okay, let's assume animals matter morally.
Hmm.
Then they ask, even if they have this strong moral status, can killing still be ethically okay? And their method is systematic. They examine 8 major ethical theories the usual suspects use to argue against killing. And they show how each one, in certain real-world constrained situations, can actually argue for the moral permissibility or even the correctness, the necessity of killing animals.
So they list 8 frameworks. Can you maybe name them?
Sure. They look at consequentialism, natural law or deontology, that's the rights-based stuff, religious ethics, virtue ethics, care ethics, contractarianism, ethical particularism, and finally, environmental ethics. Quite the list.
Okay, so instead of fighting the ethics, they're saying, let's take your rules seriously and see where they lead. That's a really powerful approach. This is where it gets really, really interesting, I think. Let's look at maybe 3 or 4 of the most sort of counterintuitive arguments they found, starting with consequentialism. This is all about outcomes, right? The consequences. And action is good if it leads to the best overall result, usually minimizing suffering or maximizing well-being.
Right, and opponents often simplify this. Killing causes harm, therefore killing is wrong. End of story.
But it's not that simple.
Not according to this paper. The authors argue the calculation is much broader. The justification for killing isn't just about the animal killed, but the outcome for all affected sentient beings. So if killing, say, one animal prevents immense suffering for thousands of others, well, the consequentialist math might actually demand that lethal action.
So it's about expanding the scope of who counts in the calculation. It's not just individual welfare, but the welfare of the whole affected group.
Exactly. Collective welfare becomes key. And the paper uses this framework to explore some really, radical ideas. If you push consequentialism to its logical extreme, especially a version called negative utilitarianism, which is the only thing that matters is eliminating suffering.
Okay, where does that lead?
It leads to some pretty startling, almost dystopian conclusions. Suggested remedies for the world's suffering have included things like mass genetic engineering to remove pain entirely from the animal kingdom.
Whoa!
Or converting all carnivores into herbivores, or even, get this, the sterilization and eventual elimination of all animal life. Because, No life, no suffering.
Good grief. That's intense. So the most ethical outcome, purely by that logic, is basically ending biology as we know it. It really highlights how focusing only on one metric, like minimizing harm without other constraints, can lead to utterly bizarre or ecologically impossible places.
That's a very strong point they make. It shows the framework itself can be problematic if you don't ground it in reality.
Okay, let's shift gears completely. How about natural law or deontology? This is the big one for animal rights, focused on duties, rights. Think Tom Reagan. How on earth can a rights-based view support killing without just contradicting itself?
This, for me, was one of the most striking parts of the paper. They actually use Reagan's own work to challenge that rigid no-killing stance. Reagan developed something called the mini-ride principle.
The mini-ride principle sounds
Right.
like a tiebreaker in a moral dilemma.
That's a good way to put it. It's like ethical triage. The principle basically says, when harm is unavoidable and all involved face similar significant harm, the rights of the many can override the rights of the few. You have to make a choice, harm will happen. So you choose the path that saves the most individuals whose rights are threatened.
Okay, can you give a concrete example? How does that play out?
Yeah, the classic one is island conservation.
Yeah.
Imagine you have a small number of invasive rats, sentient beings, let's grant them rights under this view, but these rats are absolutely devastating thousands upon thousands of ground-nesting seabirds every single year, wiping them out.
Right, a common scenario.
The mini-ride principle allows, even arguably requires, killing that smaller number of rats to prevent the death and suffering of the vastly larger number of seabirds. It frames the killing not just as permissible, but as a moral duty to prevent the greater harm, the violation of more rights.
That is genuinely stunning, using the foundational philosophy of animal rights to not just allow, but sometimes demand lethal intervention.
Yeah, it forces critics to grapple with the fact that the very system they champion might contain the justification for actions they typically condemn outright.
Okay, fascinating. Let's turn to virtue ethics. This one's different again, focusing on the character of the person acting, are they compassionate, just acting with integrity? So if a virtuous person is supposed to be compassionate, wouldn't they just always choose not to kill?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But the paper argues that sometimes acting virtuously demands killing animals. The argument is that compassion isn't just about avoiding harm, it's realized when you actively prevent or minimize greater harm.
But how can the act of killing itself be seen as compassionate? That feels like a contradiction.
Well, the authors make a really crucial distinction here, one that often gets lost. They separate death itself from pain and suffering. They argue that death isn't necessarily the worst point on the scale of harm. Killing can be done quickly, humanely, without causing undue pain, stress, or suffering, like a well-placed shot from a skilled marksman. So a virtuous wildlife manager, facing, say, a situation of massive overpopulation leading to starvation and disease.
A slow, miserable death for many.
Exactly. That virtuous manager might choose a swift, targeted lethal control policy precisely out of compassion to prevent that far greater prolonged tragedy. The virtuous act is choosing the least bad option to prevent catastrophe.
That's a really important philosophical point, separating the event of death from the ethical wrong of causing suffering.
Yes, it shows the virtuous person isn't necessarily the one who does nothing, but the one who makes the tough, decisive choice to maintain balance and prevent wider suffering, even if that choice involves killing.
Okay, one more framework, environmental ethics. Specifically, things like ecocentrism or the land ethic. This one shifts the focus entirely, right? Away from individuals.
Totally. This framework zooms out. The moral community isn't just individual sentient beings, it's the whole ecosystem. The soils, waters, plants, and animals together. They draw heavily on Aldo Leopold's famous maxim.
Ah, the biotic community idea.
That's the one. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community.
So the health of the whole system trumps the rights or interests of any single part.
Pretty much. Therefore, killing animals, the obvious example being lethal control of invasive species that are wrecking a native ecosystem, becomes morally permissible, even obligatory, if it supports the overall health, integrity, and stability of that system. If an individual life, or even a whole population, is fundamentally undermining the ecological whole, then protecting the whole takes moral priority.
Okay, so we've seen consequentialism, deontology, virtue ethics, environmental ethics, all potentially justifying killing in certain contexts. What's the big takeaway from all this? Is the paper saying killing is just fine?
No, not fine in a casual sense.
Yeah.
But it is saying that intentional animal killing isn't the simple black and white ethical or unethical issue it's often portrayed as. The main point is this powerful convergence they demonstrate. Different ethical roads.
Minimizing harm, overriding rights, acting virtuously, protecting the ecosystem.
Right. They all use different logic, different justifications. Consequentialism focusing on harm reduction, deontology on rights conflicts, environmental ethics on the collective good, and they found similar patterns with religious ethics, contractarianism too. But they often arrive at the same conclusion, that intentional animal killing can be, and often is, ethically justified in a wide range of real-world situations.
And this finding has some pretty direct implications for society, doesn't it? Especially challenging that trend we see with organizations putting up no-kill signs everywhere, like zoos, shelters, universities. They use it to signal that they're virtuous, implying any killing is automatically wrong or a failure.
Exactly. The paper is quite direct about this. It suggests that kind of institutional virtue signaling is often ethically unnecessary. It's unnecessary because it ignores this broad, robust ethical support for lethal action. When that action genuinely prevents greater harm or upholds other important values, it can be an intellectual failure to just assume no kill is always the highest moral ground.
And thinking practically, this kind of analysis must be incredibly important for people on the ground, right? Wildlife managers, conservationists, farmers, people making incredibly difficult life and death decisions.
Absolutely. It gives them intellectual and ethical resources. It shows that their reasoning when they do decide lethal action is necessary isn't some rogue, unethical stance. It can be soundly justified, often using the very ethical systems their critics might employ.
But the authors do include caveats, don't they? It's not a free pass.
Oh, definitely not. They're careful to point out limitations. For example, judging net suffering for consequentialism is really subjective and open to bias. And they mention the potential danger if environmental ethics were taken too far. Prioritizing the ecosystem above all else could lead to what some critics have termed ecological fascism, potentially overriding fundamental human rights too. So balance and context are absolutely key. You can't just pick one framework and ignore everything else.
That makes sense. Okay, let's try and sum this up. Our deep dive into this Allen et al. Paper really shows that maybe clinging to simplistic, rigid, no-killing positions isn't always the most ethical stance. It suggests we have a responsibility to look much deeper into the why, the moral justification, or even the moral necessity behind lethal actions in specific contexts.
Yeah, that's the core message. Intentional animal killing isn't automatically unethical. We've seen multiple major ethical systems allow it, sometimes even demand it, especially when it serves crucial goals like conservation, maintaining cultural practices, protecting human or animal health and well-being, and particularly when the so-called non-lethal alternatives would actually lead to much worse outcomes, more suffering down the line.
Which leaves us, and you the listener, with a final, perhaps uncomfortable thought to mull over. The paper argues that humans sometimes have a responsibility to kill animals in ethically supported ways, not just permission, but maybe even a duty. So if that's the case, what responsibility do you have to actually understand and be able to articulate the ethical arguments that might support the food you eat, the resources you use, or the conservation actions taken in your name? If you oppose an outcome, you really need to engage with the ethics that might demand it. Definitely something to chew on until our next deep dive.